Good afternoon, and thank you for joining with us here today. I realize that it was short notice, so I appreciate you being here. This morning, I've met with the families of Adam Toledo and Anthony Alvarez as we approach the anniversary of their deaths. I wanted to update the public on our conclusions of both of these investigations. This is a somber announcement, as there are no winners in this very tragic situation. We have a 13-year-old boy and another young man dead at the hands of law enforcement. Their families, as well as the families of the officers and the officers themselves, are permanently altered as a result of these incidents. In 2019, I created the Law Enforcement Accountability Division, which is known as LEAD, to have a standalone division made up of veteran prosecutors who review investigations, prosecute police officers charged with criminal offenses, and to determine whether the filing of criminal charges is appropriate. The LEAD unit has investigated the shootings of Adam Toledo and Anthony Alvarez, and I will talk about those cases individually. I know that many of you have seen the video in these cases, but I will summarize the incidents. We'll begin first with Adam Toledo. On March 29, 2001, Chicago police officer Eric Stillman discharged his weapon one time at Adam Toledo, who was 13 at the time of the incident. This occurred during a foot chase in which Adam stopped next to a fence, discarded his weapon he was carrying as he was turning towards the officer while raising his hands in the air. As Adam was turning toward the officer discharged his weapon. Adam was struck in the chest and he died from his injuries. The pistol was recovered behind the fence several feet from where Adam collapsed. The Civilian Office of Police Accountability, also known as COPA, conducted an investigation into Officer Stillman's use of force. On December 16, 2021, COPA provided the State's Attorney's Office with their Police and Community Relations Improvement Act, PERCURA, report detailing their findings. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office Bureau of Investigations assisted with the criminal investigation, and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has looked at the facts, the evidence, and the law in making our charging decisions. The evidence we reviewed included, but was not limited to, the Chicago Police and COPA reports, officer and witness interviews, Illinois State Police Crime Lab analysis and reports, our Cook County State's Attorney's Office investigative reports, recorded video footage, and medical records. When we look at these cases, we must now also look at the law as it applies. Under Illinois law, an officer is justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm when he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or to other such persons. The case law that we rely on recognizes that police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions and judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. The facts of this incident, as they played out, was that there was a shot spotter alert that indicated that 8 gunshots had been fired at that approximate location. When police officers arrived at this location, the officer observed 2 males, now known to be Adam Toledo and Ruben Roman, walking side by side down the alley. No other individuals were present on the street or in the alley. The officers pulled up behind Roman and Toledo in an attempt to investigate the shot spotter alert. Mr. Roman and Adam looked back at the officers and attempted to run from the officers. As Adam ran, his hands were near his waistband. Officer Stillman believed that Adam had a gun. After running nearly a full block in the alley, Officer Stillman saw a handgun in Adam's right hand and shouted for him to drop it. Before dropping the weapon, Adam began turning his body towards Officer Stillman with his left hand raised up in front of his body and his right hand lowered to his side behind the wooden fence post. Officer Stillman saw the weapon in Adam Toledo's right hand as Adam was stopped near the wooden fence and began turning towards Officer Stillman. From this point, several things began to happen almost simultaneously. Adam Toledo was turning his body towards Officer Stillman with his left hand raised and was also discarding the firearm that he held in his right hand behind that fence. While turning towards Officer Stillman, Adam Toledo began to raise his right hand while Officer Stillman fired one round, which struck Adam as he completed his turn, and his right hand was raised, no longer held the firearm. The timing of these actions was within 1 second. To be precise, it was estimated to be 838 milliseconds. Based on the facts, the evidence, and the law, we've concluded that there was no evidence to prove that Officer Stillman acted with criminal intent. Officer Stillman fired only one shot. Officer Stillman explained that after he fired the one time, he saw Adam's right hand was empty. He assessed the situation and did not fire again because he believed the threat no longer existed. Officer Stillman reacted to the perceived threat presented by Adam Toledo, who he believed at the time was turning toward him to shoot him. After the single shot was fired and Officer Stillman recognized that Adam Toledo was no longer a threat, he immediately rendered aid and continued to do so until the assisting officers and the paramedics arrived. Now, while it may be determined that Officer Stillman violated the Chicago Police Department's chase policies during the pursuit of Adam Toledo, the charging decision made by the state's attorney's office must be rooted in the calculus of whether Officer Stillman's perception of whether he was in danger of imminent harm, which caused him to fatally shoot Adam Toledo, was reasonable given the totality of the circumstances surrounding the incident. Based on all of that, my office will not be filing charges in this case against Officer Stillman. Pursuant to policies and legislation which my office has supported, after making my determination, my office referred a review of this case to the Office of the Illinois State Attorney's Appellate Prosecutors Association, also known as ILSAP, for them to conduct a secondary review. ILSAP has reviewed this case and has concurred that no criminal charges are appropriate in this matter. I now want to draw our attention to the case of Anthony Alvarez. On March 31st, 2001, Officer Evan Solano fatally shot Anthony Alvarez. As previously mentioned, the state's attorney's office makes charging decisions based on the facts, the evidence, and the law. On March 31st at approximately 12:18 a.m., Chicago police officers Sammy Encarnacion and Evan Solano were on patrol in their police vehicle when they observed Anthony Alvarez walking on the sidewalk. The officers had been familiar with Anthony Alvarez from previous encounters, including the night before when Mr. Alvarez fled from the officers in a car as they attempted a traffic stop. As they approached Mr. Alvarez on the 31st, Officer Solano activated the squad's emergency lights, after which Anthony Alvarez dropped the bag of food that he was holding, as well as a drink that he was carrying, and fled on foot. The officers pursued Mr. Alvarez, illuminating him with their spotlight as he ran and held his waistband. Mr. Alvarez then turned and ran through a gangway and into an alley. Officer Solano stopped the vehicle, and the officers pursued Mr. Alvarez on foot. As Officer Encarnacion pursued Mr. Alvarez, he called him by name and ordered Mr. Alvarez to stop. As they ran, Officer Solano passed Officer Encarnacion and continued to chase Mr. Alvarez down the alley. Mr. Alvarez exited the alley and continued running. While pursuing Mr. Alvarez, neither officer had unholstered his weapon. As Mr. Alvarez turned west onto the front yard of a home, he slipped and fell onto the ground. Mr. Alvarez had his cell phone in his left hand and a handgun in his right hand as he tried to regain his footing and slipped yet a second time. As he began to use both hands to push himself off the ground, Officer Solano arrived at the corner of the residence and observed Mr. Alvarez in a crouching position with a handgun in his right hand. Officer Solano, who believed that Mr. Alvarez was waiting to ambush him as he did not observe Mr. Alvarez slip and fall, immediately drew his gun and ordered Mr. Alvarez to drop the gun. While running with the handgun in his right hand and his cell phone pocket in his left hand, Mr. Alvarez looked back towards Officer Solano, and Officer Solano fired 5 consecutive shots at Mr. Alvarez while veering to the left, away from Mr. Alvarez. Mr. Alvarez was struck twice, once in the back and once in the left thigh. Upon reaching the front steps of a second home, Mr. Alvarez released the gun from his hand and collapsed to the ground. Officer Encarnacion then approached Mr. Alvarez and life-saving measures were attempted as Officer Solano called in their location and requested EMS assistance. Mr. Alvarez was subsequently transported to the Chicago Fire Department ambulance, or by Chicago Fire Department ambulance, to Illinois Masonic Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead. The Cook County Medical Examiner determined that the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds, and the manner of death is a homicide. Chicago Police Department Incident Response Team and COPA investigated this incident. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence collected during the investigation to determine whether there were a good faith basis for the filing of criminal charges. In applying that, we looked at the law associated with filing of charges for first-degree or second-degree murder. A criminal prosecution for either first or second-degree murder would require proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the involved officer was not legally justified in using deadly force against Mr. Alvarez. As in the Toledo case, an officer is justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm when he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or such other person. As Officer Solano rounded the corner and observed Mr. Alvarez in a crouching position with a gun in his hand, and also observed Mr. Alvarez looking back at him while running with the gun in his hand, he thought Mr. Alvarez was turning to shoot toward him and his partner, who he believed was behind him. Officer Solano then fired 5 successive shots in the span of 1 second as he veered to the left to avoid any shots fired by Mr. Alvarez, and he stopped once he no longer saw the gun in Mr. Alvarez's hands. Officer Solano, when he approached Mr. Alvarez, who asked, "Why did you shoot me?" Officer Solano vehemently replied, "You had a gun." Officer Encarnacion then approached Mr. Alvarez and began to administer first aid as Officer Solano called in their location and requested EMS. Officer Solano then assisted Officer Encarnacion with administering chest compressions until assisting officers arrived. After a thorough review, the office has concluded that the evidence in this case is insufficient to support criminal charges against police officer Evan Solano. As with the case of Adam Toledo, the Illinois State Appellate Prosecutors have reviewed this case and has concurred with our decision that no criminal charges are appropriate. I want to take a moment to make something abundantly clear about the shooting of Anthony Alvarez. While the evidence is insufficient to support criminal charges, it is important to highlight that the officers themselves created the conditions which the use of deadly force became necessary. First, it was unnecessary for the officers to stop and engage with Mr. Alvarez, who was walking through a gas station parking lot holding food and drink. He was not committing any crimes that were readily apparent to the officers at the time. Evidence has uncovered that this encounter occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that Mr. Alvarez would not have been arrested for the traffic offenses that occurred the night before. In addition, the officers were aware of Mr. Alvarez's home address and could have sought to contact him there to further pursue any necessary investigation into the non-custodial traffic offenses committed the night before. Second, Officer Solano may have committed several foot pursuit policy violations during his foot chase of Mr. Alvarez, such as rounding corners blind without first slowing to assess any danger and not creating distance or waiting for his partner upon observing Mr. Alvarez with the firearm. These policy violations may have further exacerbated the conditions that led to this deadly encounter. Despite this, the law, for us to charge a criminal case, is based on the reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm at the time of the shooting. The burden of proof in a criminal case is much different than the burden of proof used to determine whether policy violations will lead to adverse employment consequences. That is a decision that will be made by the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. In this instance, we would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Officer Solano's belief that either he or his partner were in danger of imminent death or great bodily harm was unreasonable at the time of the shooting. The time of the shooting. The evidence in this case does not support the filing of criminal charges, and the state would be unable to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Officer Solano committed the offense of first-degree murder. As is our process, the formal declination memos for both of these cases and all fatal police shootings outlining the facts, the evidence, and the law can be found at our website at cookcountystatesattorney.org. I want to once again publicly give my deepest condolences to the family of Anthony Alvarez and Adam Toledo. I sat with them here in the office earlier this morning, and the grief on their mothers and their fathers and family members' faces was almost unbearable. To lose a child is beyond what any of us would want to imagine. To lose a child at the hands of law enforcement was unfathomable for them. And recognizing that we must be bound by the facts, the evidence, and the law, and that it was profoundly disappointing that here in the criminal courts to them, there was no accountability. We must be guided, as always, by the principles of just prosecution. And that is what these decisions reflect today.